My husband kissed me goodbye to go visit his mama down south in Georgia, but when I called him later to check in, he forgot to hang up the phone. That's when I heard my husband say, "Just wait until that $1 million check from her daddy clears. I'm going to leave that simple-minded wife of mine with nothing, and we're going to get married and raise this baby together." I went into shock. It turned out my husband was with my best friend, and she was pregnant with his child. In that moment, my whole world felt like it was crumbling to dust. But I wasn't about to sit there with my hands folded. I was going to make sure they regretted this betrayal. Before the story begins, please drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're tuning in from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can keep growing and bringing you even more intense stories. The morning atmosphere in our sprawling estate in Buckhead, Atlanta, was warm and peaceful, as if no storm were brewing on the horizon. Sunlight filtered through the plantation shutters, illuminating a living room decked out in custom designer furniture. There, Vianne was busy folding clothes for her husband, Trevante. She performed the task with care and affection. Today, Trevante was heading to his hometown, a small rural community just outside of Macon, Georgia, to visit his mother, Eudora, who was rumored to be gravely ill. As a devoted wife, Vianne naturally felt worried about her mother-in-law's condition. She actually wanted to go with him, but Trevante forbade it, arguing that the long drive down those country roads would be exhausting. He didn't want to see her tired, especially since Vianne had just recovered from a slight cold. Vianne went along with her husband's wishes, trusting that Trevante cared deeply about her health. Trevante came out of the bathroom, his fresh lineup still sharp, skin glowing from the steam. His face looked fresh, but he wore a mask of sadness that he seemed to be projecting on purpose. He walked over to Vianne, who was packing the last item into a leather duffel bag. Vianne looked at her husband with tenderness, rubbing his arm to give him strength. She knew how much Trevante loved his mama, and the news of her sickness must have hit him hard. Vianne had packed him some snacks and a bottle of alkaline water so he wouldn't get hungry on the road. She made sure his wallet, his cell phone, and everything else were safe in the bag. There wasn't a shred of suspicion in her heart. To her, Trevante was the perfect husband, hard-working and loving toward his family. During their 3 years of marriage, Trevante had always been sweet and had never shown any strange behavior. Saying goodbye on the porch of their brick mansion, Trevante hugged Vianne tight, as if it pained him to leave her alone for a few days. He kissed her forehead for a long time, asking Vianne to take care of herself, to make sure the gate was locked, and not to wait up if he got back late the day after tomorrow. Vianne nodded obediently. She tucked a thick stack of cash into his jacket pocket, telling him it was to buy fruit or medicine for Mother Eudora. Trevante smiled slightly, thanking her with a tone that sounded sincere, and then hopped into his luxury sedan. Vianne stood in the doorway, waving until her husband's car disappeared around the curve of the manicured street in their gated community. Her heart felt suddenly empty, but she pushed that feeling aside, praying her husband would arrive safe and sound, and that her mother-in-law would have a speedy recovery. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked away, turning morning into afternoon, and afternoon into dusk. Vianne passed the time reading a book in the parlor and tending to some fiddle-leaf figs in the sunroom. When the sun began to set, a wave of longing and anxiety started to wash over her. By her calculations, Trevante should have been just about pulling up to his mama's house by now. Vianne decided to call her husband just to make sure he was okay and that the drive had gone smoothly. She picked up her phone from the coffee table, found her husband's contact, and pressed the call button. It rang several times before he finally answered. Trevante's voice sounded loud on the other end. His breathing was a little heavy, as if he were walking fast or lifting something heavy. Trevante answered Vianne's greeting with a somewhat rushed tone. He said he had just arrived and that the signal out there in the sticks was terrible, so he had to hang up to help some relatives who were taking care of Eudora. Vianne, ever understanding, nodded immediately. She didn't want to bother her husband while he was focused on his mother. Vianne said goodbye and waited for Trevante to hang up the phone. But this is where things got strange. The call didn't disconnect. It seemed Trevante had forgotten to hit the red button, Or maybe the screen of his phone brushed against something accidental, keeping the line open without him realizing it. Vianne was about to hang up on her end, but her finger froze when she heard a rustling sound followed by the slam of a car door. Apparently, Travante hadn't arrived at his mother's house yet, or maybe he was somewhere else entirely. Vianne pressed the phone back to her ear. Curiosity began to take hold. She heard the sound of footsteps on ceramic tile, not the crunch of a dirt road or the cracked pavement of a rural driveway. Then she heard a laugh that was all too familiar. It was Travante's laugh, but not a sad or worried laugh like the one he had worn this morning. It was a liberated laugh, a laugh full of triumph that sounded strange and terrifying to Vianne in that moment. Vianne's heart started pounding against her ribs. A bad feeling washed over her suddenly. She heard Travante speaking loudly. His voice was crystal clear, as if he had set the phone down on a table right in front of him. Travante said he was finally free from the exhausting performance he'd been putting on all day. Vianne frowned, not understanding what he meant by performance. But the next sentence that came out of her husband's mouth struck like lightning on a clear day, destroying all the trust Vianne had built over the years. Travante said, with a tone of utter contempt, that someone just needed to have patience until the check for $1 million from Vianne's father cleared. Travante bluntly declared his plan to abandon Vianne the second they had that money in their hands. The words, "that simple-minded wife of mine," flowed smoothly from the lips of the man who just that morning had kissed her forehead with such tenderness. Vianne's chest tightened. Her breath hitched. She wanted to scream, she wanted to curse, but her voice seemed to vanish, swallowed by overwhelming shock. Before she could even process the pain, she heard another woman's voice answering Travante. That voice was so familiar, a voice that often filled her days. The voice she had entrusted with her secrets. It was the voice of Calisso, her best friend. Calisso laughed heartily, agreeing with Travante, and calling Vianne completely clueless for not realizing what was happening right under her nose. Vianne felt her world collapsing. The friend she trusted, the woman she had often helped out financially, turned out to be a venomous snake strangling her marriage. Tears began to stream down Vianne's cheeks, but she held back her sobs with all her might so they wouldn't hear her. Her trembling hand quickly pressed the record button on her phone screen. She needed receipts. She had to be strong. The conversation on the other end grew more and more heartbreaking. She heard Travante pampering Calisso, asking about the status of her pregnancy. This new revelation made Vianne feel nauseous. Calisso was pregnant with Travante's child. They were talking about their future, the luxury mansion they would buy, the vacations overseas, and how they would raise this child together using Vianne's father's money. They were celebrating their betrayal on the back of Vianne's suffering, whom they considered stupid and naive. Vianne heard Travante say he was sick of pretending to be a devoted, faithful husband in front of her. He was sick of listening to her father's sermons about black excellence, business, and ethics. Travante confessed that the only reason he was holding on was the inheritance and the capital injection Vianne's father had promised for a fictitious business project Travante had pitched. Meanwhile, Calisso was asking Travante to spend more time with her because she didn't want her son born without a father by her side. Calisso even mocked Vianne's sense of style, calling it outdated and boring. Unlike her, she claimed, she always looked attractive in Travante's eyes. Every word that came out of their mouths was a dagger driving deeper and deeper into Vianne's heart. Vianne's body slid down to the floor, leaning against the sofa in a living room that now felt cold and foreign. She hugged her knees with one arm while the other kept holding the phone, recording all that filth. She heard the clinking of glasses. Maybe they were toasting to celebrate their evil plan. There was no alcohol mentioned, maybe just juice or tea, but the celebration was equally profane in Vianne's eyes. Because it was built on the ruins of her marriage, the pain slowly transformed into disgust. Disgust at imagining Travante's hands, which had touched her that morning, touching Calisso. Disgust at imagining that Travante's sweet smile was just a mask to hide his greed. After nearly 10 minutes of torture, the conversation began to wind down. She heard Travante say he had to turn off his phone so Vianne wouldn't get suspicious if she called again. Vianne's heart raced. She quickly stopped the recording just a split second before the call cut off from the other end. The phone screen went dark, reflecting Vianne's face with swollen eyes and a hollow stare. Silence reigned once again in the big house, but this time the silence was terrifying. Vianne remained sitting on the floor. Her legs felt too weak to stand. She never imagined such a cliché drama, like something out of a Tyler Perry movie, would happen in her own life. Her husband and her best friend, the two people closest to her, conspiring to destroy her. But in the midst of that devastation, a small seed of determination began to grow in a corner of her heart. She wouldn't let them win. She wouldn't be the stupid woman they said she was. Vianne spent hours in the same position, letting the tears dry on her cheeks. The pain that had hit her so hard was slowly metamorphosing into a cold, lethal rage. She replayed the voice recording on her phone, listening to every insult and the despicable plan of Travante and Calisso over and over again. Every time she listened, her love for Travante eroded, replaced by a calculated hatred. She also remembered all the moments she had spent with Calisso, how Calisso used to praise Vianne's kindness, how Calisso often asked to borrow money for urgent needs, and how Calisso was always present at every one of Vianne's family events. It turned out it was all a strategy to get close to Travante and gnaw away at Vianne's fortune from the inside. Vianne felt like a blind person who had just been given her sight back. Now all the oddities of the past made sense. She stood up, brushing the invisible dust off her clothes. Her first step was to go to the bathroom, washing her face with cold water to erase the traces of tears. She looked in the mirror. The woman in the reflection looked fragile, but her gaze was now sharp as an eagle's. She fixed her hair, ensuring no visible sign of sadness remained. She had to play her cards right. If she confronted them now, Travante would deny everything and flip the script. Travante was slick. He could say the recording was edited, or that it was just a joke. Vianne needed more than just a voice recording. She needed their total destruction at the very moment they felt they were on top. Next, Vianne picked up her phone and called the one person who had the absolute power to help her, her father. Vianne's father, Mr. Sterling, was a veteran businessman and a pillar of the community, someone very protective of his only daughter. When the call connected, Vianne tried to control her breathing so her voice would sound steady. She asked her father to come over immediately or to meet in a secure location because there was something urgent affecting the life and death of the company and her marriage. Hearing the serious tone of his daughter, her father agreed to come without asking questions. Vianne knew that involving her father was a major step because Mr. Sterling's fury could end Travante's career overnight. But Vianne didn't want Travante's destruction to happen overnight. She wanted Travante to feel like he was flying high before she slammed him into the concrete. An hour later, her father arrived. In the soundproof home office, Vianne played him the recording. Her father's reaction was exactly as she expected. The old man's face turned red with suppressed rage. His hands clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. He was about to call his lawyer and the police to have Travante arrested right then and there, but Vianne stopped him calmly. Vianne laid out her plan. She asked her father to hold back. She asked him to keep being nice to Travante, to even pretend that the $1 million was about to clear. Vianne explained that the best revenge was to let Travante and Calisso dig their own grave with their greed. The father looked at his daughter with new eyes. There was a mix of pride and sadness, seeing that his daughter had to become this hard, but he finally agreed to follow Vianne's script. After her father left, Vianne began to map out her strategy in detail. She cleaned the house as if nothing had happened. She even cooked Travante's favorite meal, oxtails and butter beans, just in case her husband came back early or to welcome him later. And so it was. 2 days later, Travante returned. The sound of his car pulling into the garage made Vianne's heart race, not out of love, but adrenaline. This was the first act of her performance. She had to be the best actress in her own life. Vianne walked to the front door, putting on the sweetest smile she could muster. When the door opened, Travante's figure appeared with a falsely tired face. Travante hugged Vianne immediately, complaining about how exhausting the trip had been and how sad he was about his mother's condition. Vianne hugged him back. Although every cell in her body screamed with disgust, she held her breath so she wouldn't smell another woman's perfume that might be faintly lingering on Travante's clothes. With a tone full of concern, Vianne asked about Mother Eudora's condition. Travante lied fluently, making up a story about the doctor's diagnosis, about expensive medicines that needed to be bought, and about how his mother wouldn't stop asking for her. Vianne nodded, feigning deep sympathy, but inside she was noting every lie as fuel for her hatred. She even offered to visit Eudora the following week, which Travante subtly rejected with the excuse that the doctor had recommended isolation and total rest. That night was the hardest test for Vianne, sleeping in the same bed with a traitor. Travante fell asleep deep and fast, perhaps tired after spending a good time with Calisso in what he called visiting his sick mother. Vianne lay beside him, staring at the dark ceiling of the room. She listened to her husband's soft snoring, a sound that used to give her security but now sounded like that of a monster. Vianne turned on her side, looking at Travante's face in the darkness. That face, which looked so innocent while sleeping, hid a million deceits. Vianne whispered very softly, almost inaudibly, promising that every tear she had shed that day would be paid for with drops of Travante's sweat and blood in the future. The next morning, Vianne started her performance. Over breakfast, with a radiant face, she gave Travante some big news. She told him her father had just called to inform her that the asset liquidation process for the $1 million was moving faster than expected. Travante's eyes sparkled instantly. The spoon in his hand stopped for a moment. Greed was clearly reflected in his gaze. Although he tried to hide it with a smile of gratitude, Travante asked enthusiastically when he could receive the money. Vianne replied that maybe in a week or two, but there were some documents Travante had to handle for the change of asset ownership and to reduce taxes. Of course, it was a lie. It was just Vianne's way of keeping Travante busy and making him feel like victory was within reach. Travante seemed overjoyed. He even forgot to feign sadness about his mother. He immediately started talking about his fake business plans, as if the money were already in his hands. Vianne listened attentively, occasionally offering supportive suggestions, making Travante feel more and more on top of the world. In the middle of breakfast, Travante's phone vibrated. Travante glanced at the screen briefly and then quickly silenced it. Vianne knew it must be Calisso. With an innocent tone, Vianne asked, "Who was calling?" "Just a colleague asking about the progress of a project," Travante replied. Vianne smiled and nodded. Inside, she was laughing. She knew Travante must be itching to tell Calisso the news about the $1 million, and that was exactly what Vianne wanted. The higher their hopes, the more devastating their fall would be. That afternoon, Vianne left the house on purpose with the excuse of doing the monthly grocery run. Her goal was to give Travante space to call his accomplices freely. From a listening app she had secretly installed on Travante's phone while he was in the shower that morning, Vianne could hear his conversation in real time. Sure enough, as soon as Vianne walked out the door, Travante called Calisso. Travante's voice sounded euphoric. He was shouting with joy, announcing that the jackpot was about to land. He promised Calisso a luxury house in an exclusive subdivision as a pregnancy gift. Hearing this, Vianne, who was driving her SUV, just smiled coldly. "Keep dreaming, Travante. Dream as big as you can," Vianne murmured as she gripped the steering wheel tight. Her revenge plan had just begun, and she would make sure there was no escape for the traitors. The news of the $1 million transfer was like a fresh wind that fanned the fire of greed in Travante's heart even more. Since Vianne told him the fake news, Travante's attitude became drastically more impatient and impulsive. Every time his phone rang, he jumped a little with an enthusiasm difficult to hide, hoping it was a call from the bank or the notary. Vianne watched her husband's behavioral change with a subtle, meaningful smile. She saw how Travante started frequently visiting luxury real estate websites and high-end car magazines on his tablet while they relaxed in the living room. Travante didn't even try to hide his interest in luxury items that were previously out of reach on his monthly salary. To Vianne, this was a sign that the bait she had thrown had been swallowed whole. The big fish was already on the hook. It was just a matter of waiting for the right moment to pull him out of the water and leave him gasping for air. To accelerate her plan, Vianne decided to level up her game. She wanted to see Caliso's face, the woman who had stabbed her in the back, right in front of her. Vianne wanted to see how the two traitors acted in front of her eyes. So during dinner, with a relaxed and natural tone of voice, Vianne proposed an idea to Travante. She suggested inviting Caliso over for dinner in 2 days. The reason was simple. Vianne said she missed her friend because they hadn't seen each other in a while and she wanted to catch up. Plus, Vianne argued she wanted to celebrate the good news about her father's money in private. Although the money hadn't been transferred yet, at least they could share their happiness with someone close. Travante seemed surprised by the suggestion. His face tensed for a moment. His eyes darted around nervously. Maybe he feared his charade would be exposed if his wife and his mistress were in the same room. However, his greedy and arrogant nature quickly took control. Travante thought it was an excellent opportunity to show Caliso the luxury that would soon be hers. So Travante accepted the idea with feigned enthusiasm, saying it was a fantastic idea to stay in touch. The day of the dinner arrived. Vianne had been busy in the kitchen since the afternoon, preparing special dishes as if welcoming a guest of honor. She cooked several of Caliso's favorite dishes: blackened salmon, candied yams, and mac and cheese, a gesture she used to do out of friendship, but now performed as part of her psychological warfare strategy. The aroma of the food filled the whole house, creating the illusion of a perfect, warm home. Exactly at 8:00 p.m., the doorbell rang. Travante ran to open the door, acting like a lovesick teenager, very different from the cool attitude he usually showed with Vianne's other guests. Vianne walked slowly from the dining room, controlling her breathing and her expression. When she saw Caliso enter, she felt a burning in her chest, holding back her rage. Caliso was perfectly made up, wearing a wig laid to the gods and clothes that were quite tight, trying to highlight her curves. However, Vianne could clearly see a slight change in her friend's figure, especially in her abdomen, which was starting to protrude a bit, though it could still be hidden. Vianne welcomed Caliso with a warm hug, a hug that for Caliso might seem normal, but for Vianne was the goodbye hug to their dead friendship. Caliso hugged her back awkwardly. Her eyes darted sideways to Travante, who was standing behind Vianne with a cheeky grin. They thought Vianne didn't see those exchanged glances, but Vianne caught it all clearly through the reflection of the large mirror hanging on the foyer wall. Vianne invited Caliso to sit in the dining room, which was already elegantly set. There were no alcoholic drinks. Vianne only served fresh peach tea and cold sparkling water, in line with the lifestyle principles Caliso had always ridiculed behind her back as bougie and boring. The atmosphere at dinner was strange. Travante tried too hard to break the ice with bad jokes. Caliso laughed too loud in response to those jokes. Vianne just smiled politely, interjecting occasionally with short sentences. In the middle of dinner, Vianne started her attack. She poured sparkling water into Caliso's empty glass. With a fixed gaze and a smile difficult to interpret, Vianne said in a low but firm voice that she should eat plenty. Vianne commented that Caliso looked thicker lately. Her cheeks were fuller, and her aura was different. Vianne paused deliberately in her sentence, making Caliso's and Travante's hearts stop for a moment. Before continuing to say that Caliso looked like someone expecting great happiness, Caliso's face, which was previously blushed from makeup, went pale instantly. The fork in her hand clinked softly against the plate. Travante choked on his drink, coughing a bit to hide his nervousness. Vianne quickly offered Travante a napkin, patting him on the back affectionately. She asked with an innocent tone if Travante was okay, asking why he was reacting so dramatically, just because she had complimented Caliso on gaining some healthy weight. Travante shook his head quickly, saying he had just swallowed wrong. Calisso, who had regained her composure, tried to smile forcedly, saying maybe she had been stress-eating lately due to work. Vianne nodded as if she believed her, but her gaze remained fixed on Calisso's eyes, as if she were stripping her friend's soul bare. Then, Vianne started talking about the plans for the $1 million. She said she wanted to renovate the house and perhaps donate a large portion to a charity foundation because she and Travante didn't need that much money. Hearing the word donate, Calisso's and Travante's eyes went wide. They looked at each other in panic and quickly interrupted her, saying it would be a shame to donate it, that it was better to invest it for their children's future. Vianne smiled to herself. Her hook had worked. The fear of losing the money they didn't even have yet was beginning to erode their sanity. The night ended with Calisso saying goodbye early with the excuse of not feeling well, leaving Vianne in the doorway with a smile of victory. One act was over, and the enemy's morale was already beginning to waver. After the tense dinner, Travante became even more obsessed with the money. Vianne's comment about donating the money left him in a state of panic. He felt he had to secure the assets or make a huge financial commitment so Vianne couldn't get rid of the money at her whim to some foundation. In Travante's narrow mind, poisoned by Calisso and his mother, the $1 million was his right, as compensation for his patience in putting up with Vianne all these years. Travante started leaving the house frequently with the excuse of meeting clients or inspecting job sites, when in reality he was house hunting with Calisso. Calisso, feeling her position threatened after Vianne's hint at dinner, demanded Travante buy her a house immediately as proof of his seriousness and as a guarantee for the future of the child in her womb. The woman wouldn't stop complaining and inciting Travante, telling him Vianne could change her mind at any moment, so they had to act fast. Travante took Calisso to see a newly built luxury subdivision on the outskirts of Atlanta. The houses were modern farmhouse style with imposing pillars, just like in Calisso's dreams. They stopped in front of the largest unit, on a corner lot, a 2-story house with a private pool and a spacious yard. Calisso fell in love at first sight. She toured the rooms with sparkling eyes, imagining herself as the lady of that palace, organizing lavish parties and showing off her wealth to her friends. She hugged Travante affectionately, telling him this was her dream house, and she didn't want to see any other. The problem was, the price of the house was astronomical, far above Travante's savings, which were actually insignificant. The developer required a hefty down payment and the rest paid in short installments if they wanted to get a special promotional price. Travante was desperate. He knew Vianne's father's money hadn't arrived yet, but Calisso kept pressuring him, and he himself feared losing the chance to get that luxury home. Here is where Vianne's role came back into play. Vianne, who already knew her husband's movements thanks to the GPS tracker on his car and reports from a private investigator hired by her father, started adding more fuel to the fire. When Travante came home frowning, Vianne asked him enthusiastically about the project he was managing. Vianne pretended to have received information from a friend who worked in real estate that land prices in the area of the subdivision Travante had visited were going to skyrocket next month. Vianne encouraged Travante to make a major investment decision while he had the chance, assuring him the $1 million would clear in a matter of days. Vianne's words were like a spell that clouded Travante's logic. His legitimate wife's support made him feel his decision was right and safe. But Travante still needed cash immediately for the down payment and closing costs, which amounted to a considerable sum. No official bank would lend him that much money in such a short time without a long and complicated verification process, especially with Travante's mediocre credit history. Desperate and blinded by greed, Travante finally contacted an old acquaintance who had access to non-bank lenders, basically high-level loan sharks. They could get him thousands in a matter of hours, as long as there was collateral of a high-value property deed. Travante remembered the safe in Vianne's home office. The deed to the luxury house they lived in was kept there. The house was a wedding gift from Vianne's father, but the deed was still in her father's name, who had entrusted it to them for safekeeping. Travante, in his stupidity, thought he could borrow the deed for a while, pawn it to get the down payment for Calisso's house, and then get it back the following week as soon as Vianne's father's check arrived. He believed Vianne would never find out the deed had disappeared for a few days. One afternoon, while Vianne was at a social event, Travante sneaked into the office. His hands trembled as he dialed the safe combination he had secretly spied on. The steel door opened with a soft click. There was the manila envelope with the valuable document. He grabbed it with heavy breathing. He felt like a thief in his own house, but pushed aside the guilt by imagining Calisso's happy face and the life of luxury awaiting him. He immediately took the deed to a notary associate of the loan shark. The process was very fast and simple because the collateral value was much higher than the loan. Travante signed a debt contract with exorbitant interest rates without reading it carefully. The only thing on his mind were the zeros that would appear in his bank account that afternoon. In the evening, Travante returned to their mansion. He felt he had made a master move. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were already in his personal account, and he had wired the down payment to the developer for Calisso's dream home. He felt like a winner. He felt he was one step ahead of Vianne. During dinner, Travante seemed to eat with a hearty appetite and smiled to himself frequently. Vianne watched her husband with a cold stare from behind her teacup. Vianne knew exactly what Travante had done. She knew the deed from the safe had changed hands. But Travante didn't know one thing. The deed in the safe was a forgery Vianne had deliberately placed there a few days before. The original deed was safe in a bank safety deposit box in her father's name. Travante had just pawned a fake document to a loan shark known for his cruelty and had just signed a legally binding debt contract in his name. Travante felt on top of the world. He even started behaving with a certain arrogance toward Vianne. He told Vianne to be more thrifty with the monthly grocery shopping when he himself had just wasted dirty money on his mistress. Vianne obeyed the order with submission. Inside, she was counting down the time left until her husband's ruin. That night, Travante slept soundly, dreaming of his new house with Calisso. Meanwhile, Vianne sat on the edge of the bed looking at her husband's face, calm in his ignorance. Travante had dug a very deep hole and had just jumped inside voluntarily. Vianne whispered softly, "Enjoy your last dream. Relax, baby, because tomorrow hell on earth will start to greet you." The lifestyle trap had snapped shut perfectly, and there was no spare key for Travante to get out of it. The morning at Vianne and Travante's residence felt different. There was a tension creeping slowly behind the solid walls of the luxury house. Today was the day of Mother Eudora's arrival, Travante's mother, coming up from the country with the excuse that she missed her son and daughter-in-law. But Vianne knew very well what the real motivation behind this sudden visit was. Since Travante told her the plan about Vianne's father's $1 million transfer, Eudora's attitude had changed 180 degrees. If before she always made excuses about her old age and inability to travel far, now the middle-aged woman felt suddenly fit enough to undertake a several-hour drive to the big city. Vianne received the news of her mother-in-law's arrival with a smile difficult to interpret. She knew the vicious cycle was completing itself. All the main actors of this betrayal drama were finally gathering on the same stage, making it easier for Vianne to watch them and destroy them all at once. Without leaving a trace, Vianne had prepared the guest room on the ground floor impeccably, changing the sheets for new ones and placing a vase of fresh flowers on the nightstand. A perfect welcome from a devoted daughter-in-law, the role she would keep playing until the curtain fell tragically. Travante's car pulled into the driveway just as the sun began to rise high. Vianne was at the front door, dressed in elegant, modest clothes, ready to welcome her mother-in-law. The car door opened, and out came Eudora with a somewhat exaggerated style. The woman was wearing her Sunday best, a bright suit with flashy gold jewelry on her wrists and neck, as if she wanted to prove she was the mother of a future millionaire. Her face looked fresh and healthy, far from the image of a gravely ill person Travante had described when he asked for permission to go down south. Vianne stepped forward and gave Eudora a respectful hug. Eudora pulled away a bit quickly after the hug, and her eyes immediately scanned Vianne's entire house with a critical gaze, as if she were a building inspector looking for faults. There was no warm hug or sincere questions about Vianne's state. The first sentence out of Eudora's mouth was a biting comment about the lawn, which according to her wasn't kept up enough, and the paint on the gate, which she said looked worn, even though Vianne had just hired a professional landscaper the week before. The three of them entered the house. Travante was busy carrying his mother's large suitcases, while Eudora walked like a queen inspecting her new palace. Vianne headed to the kitchen to prepare drinks and snacks. From the living room, Vianne's sharp ears caught the hushed conversation between mother and son. Eudora was asking impatiently about the certainty of the $1 million. She whispered to Travante to make sure the money didn't go anywhere else and reminded her son not to spoil Vianne too much. Vianne's heart boiled hearing that woman's cunning. It was evident the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Travante's manipulative and greedy nature was clearly inherited from his mother. Vianne took a deep breath, calming the storm in her chest, and then came out with a tray of hot tea and biscuits. She placed the tray on the table carefully, trying to act normal in front of the woman who had helped destroy her marriage. While they enjoyed the tea, Eudora began launching her subtle verbal attacks. She started comparing Vianne to Calisso. Although at first she didn't mention Calisso's name explicitly, the direction of her conversation was very clear. Eudora spoke about a friend's daughter from back home who was very good at taking care of her husband, cooking, and, what hurt the most, very fertile, capable of giving grandsons quickly. Vianne simply lowered her head, pretending to listen obediently. Then Eudora said with a cynical tone that a good wife isn't just one who has a rich daddy, but one who can serve her husband in all aspects and give him heirs to carry on the family name. That sentence was like a slap to Vianne, who hadn't had children yet after 3 years of marriage. However, Vianne knew Eudora was referring to Calisso. She knew Eudora had met Calisso back in Georgia when Travante went to visit, and that they had surely celebrated Calisso's pregnancy together. Vianne swallowed the pain, turning it into fuel for her revenge plan. The climax came when Eudora, perhaps too carried away by the euphoria of getting rich, started losing control of her tongue. While chewing a biscuit made by Vianne, she said that soon the house would be filled with the cry of a robust baby boy, and that Travante should prepare a special, luxurious room for his only heir. Travante choked on his drink, hearing his mother's slip-up. His eyes went wide, signaling his mother to shut up. Vianne, with a performance worthy of an Oscar, frowned and asked innocently what baby her mother-in-law was referring to. She asked if some relative was having a child. The atmosphere turned instantly tense and silent. Travante intervened quickly, nervous, saying his mother was just fantasizing and wishing Vianne would get pregnant with a boy soon. Eudora, realizing her mistake, laughed forcedly, confirming Travante's words and saying she was anxious to have a grandson. Vianne nodded slowly, with a slight smile, as if she believed that ridiculous excuse. But inside, she noted an important point. They were very sure the child Calisso was expecting was a boy, and they were already planning that child's future in this house, Vianne's house. That afternoon, Travante excused himself to go out for a moment with the pretext of urgent business, but Vianne knew he was going to see Calisso to calm her down, since she was surely jealous that Eudora was staying at Vianne's house. Thus, Vianne was left alone with Eudora. Eudora, feeling tired from the trip, asked Vianne to bring her small handbag, which had been left in the car, to the guest room. Vianne agreed politely. Taking the bag from the car, Vianne noticed it was quite heavy. She carried it to the guest room. Eudora was in the bathroom. Vianne didn't waste this golden opportunity. Her curiosity guided her hand to slightly unzip the bag. She had no intention of stealing. She was just looking for proof. And sure enough, a betrayed wife's instinct is sharp. In a side pocket of the bag, which was slightly open, a piece of paper stuck out, a shopping receipt they hadn't thrown away. Vianne's hand trembled as she pulled it out. It was a receipt from a well-known baby store, Bye Bye Baby, in a nearby city. Dated 2 days ago, exactly when Travante had excused himself to go to the country. Her eyes scanned the list of purchased items. a baby boy outfit set, an expensive brand electric breast pump, a nursing pillow, and premium prenatal vitamins. The total purchase amounted to a considerable sum. At the bottom of the receipt appeared the loyalty points under Travante's name. Vianne felt her breath cut short. So the money she had given Travante to buy medicine for his mother had been used to buy items for his mistress's baby. And Eudora, the woman who was supposedly gravely ill, had gone shopping with him to pick out those forbidden items. Vianne quickly took out her phone and photographed the receipt from various angles as irrefutable proof. Then she put the receipt back in its place very carefully, making sure its position was exactly the same so as not to raise suspicion. When Eudora came out of the bathroom, Vianne was already by the window fixing the curtains. Her face was calm, showing none of the whirlwind of rage burning inside her. Eudora thanked her with a dry tone and then asked Vianne to leave because she wanted to rest. Vianne nodded and closed the guest room door slowly. As soon as the door clicked shut, Vianne leaned against the hallway wall. Tears of rage fell one by one. She felt deep disgust. Disgust for Travante, disgust for Calisso, and what churned her stomach the most, Eudora's hypocrisy. The three of them were conspiring to squeeze her fortune dry, insulting her behind her back while enjoying the comforts she provided them. Vianne wiped her tears roughly. She would keep the proof of the shopping receipt in a special envelope labeled destruction evidence. That envelope was now thicker, as thick as their sins. Vianne swore there would be no mercy for them. If they wanted to play with fire, Vianne would make sure they all burned to ashes. Today, Eudora had arrived with arrogance, but later she would leave with a humiliation she wouldn't forget for the rest of her life. The sun was just beginning to dip, but the dark clouds covering the Atlanta sky seemed to reflect the mood of the house's inhabitants. After finding the proof of the baby item receipt, Vianne realized she couldn't just wait for the date of the fictitious fund transfer. She had to accelerate the process of their mental destruction. She had to create a rift between the conspirators. The divide and conquer strategy was the best option at that moment. Vianne knew the bond between Travante, Calisso, and Eudora wasn't one of sincere love, but a transactional bond based on greed. And that kind of bond is very fragile, easy to break with a little shake of suspicion. Vianne took her first step by buying a new burner phone with an anonymous SIM card. She set it up in the kitchen while no one was looking. Her first target was Calisso. Pregnant women often have unstable emotions and tend to be more suspicious. Vianne typed a short but lethal text message and sent it to Calisso's personal number. The message read, "Watch your back. The man promising you a luxury house is playing with fire with another woman, besides his wife. Don't be just a stepping stone. Check who he calls in the middle of the night." The anonymous message was sent just when Travante was at home, watching TV quietly with Eudora. Vianne watched from a corner of the room, waiting for the chain reaction. And so it was. Less than 10 minutes later, Travante's phone vibrated on the table. Travante looked at the screen, and his face tensed. He quickly grabbed the phone and headed to the back patio with the excuse of bad reception. Vianne knew Calisso must be exploding on the other end, demanding an explanation about the other woman mentioned in the mysterious message. While Travante was busy calming down a furious and manipulated Calisso, Vianne launched her second attack. This time, her target was the relationship between Travante, Eudora, and Calisso. Vianne printed a brochure she had designed herself to look very convincing. The brochure was an exclusive ad for Sunset Pines Senior Living, a luxury but isolated nursing home. On the brochure, Vianne circled several accommodation packages with a red marker and wrote a small note in the margin with handwriting that deliberately mimicked Calisso's. "The best option for Mom when we move to the new house." Then Vianne slid the brochure carefully into Travante's briefcase, which was in the living room among other office documents, but visible enough to be found if the briefcase was opened. Vianne knew Eudora's habit of snooping in her son's things, especially if it involved money or property. The second bait was taken. That afternoon, while Travante was showering, Eudora opened Travante's briefcase, probably to ensure the $1 million transfer documents were ready. But what she found was the nursing home brochure. Vianne, pretending to read a magazine on the sofa opposite, could see Eudora's face turning red. The old woman's hand trembled, holding the brochure. She read the handwritten note in the margin and immediately concluded it was Calisso's work. Eudora, who until now had bragged about Calisso as her ideal future daughter-in-law, felt betrayed. She thought Calisso wanted to dump her in a nursing home as soon as they got the money and the new house. The wrath of a mother who feels scorned is terrible. Eudora crumpled the brochure and shoved it into her robe pocket with heavy breathing, waiting for the right moment to confront them. That night, dinner turned into a cold battlefield. Travante looked exhausted and tense. Dark circles were clearly visible under his eyes due to the argument with Calisso over the phone that afternoon. He tried to be nice to his mother, but Eudora responded with curtness and a look full of suspicion. Travante was confused, not understanding why his mother had suddenly changed her attitude. Vianne enjoyed her dinner in silence, occasionally offering food to her mother-in-law with a polite smile that only managed to irritate Eudora more. Eudora probably thought Vianne was too stupid to understand the intrigue unfolding, when in reality, Vianne was the mastermind behind all the chaos. The tension reached its peak when Travante's phone rang again. This time Travante didn't dare answer. He just looked at the screen with desperation. Calisso's name appeared clearly. Seeing Travante's hesitation, Eudora, already full of prejudice, exploded. "Answer it! That illegitimate wife of yours surely wants to remind you of the promise to throw your mama in a nursing home, right?" Travante's jaw dropped, not understanding where his mother had gotten that crazy idea. "What are you talking about, Mama? Who wants to get rid of you?" Travante asked in panic. Eudora threw the crumpled nursing home brochure in his face. "Don't play dumb. I found this in your briefcase. Whose handwriting is this? If it ain't that woman's, she's barely pregnant with a bastard child and already dares to control my life," Eudora screamed hysterically. Vianne feigned surprise, dropping her silverware and covering her mouth with her hand as if she were in shock from the argument. Travante tried to defend himself, saying he knew nothing about the brochure, but Eudora was already too hurt. In the middle of the chaos, Calisso, impatient because he wasn't answering, kept calling until finally Travante was forced to answer on speaker, since his hands were busy holding back his mother, who was trying to hit him. Calisso's shrill voice filled the dining room. Without beating around the bush, Calisso shouted with a very clear, threatening tone, "Hey, Travante, don't go silent on me. If you don't wire me that extra monthly cash tonight and explain who your other side chick is, I don't care anymore. If that $1 million doesn't clear tomorrow, I'm coming to your house and telling your sanctified wife everything. Let it all burn." Calisso's scream echoed, creating a deathly silence. Travante was pale as a ghost. The blood seemed to vanish from his face. He looked at Vianne with horror. Eudora also went silent, realizing that Calisso's threat could ruin her plans to get Vianne's fortune. Both greedy mother and son were now looking at Vianne with fear, terrified she had heard and understood Calisso's threat. Vianne, who had heard everything clearly, decided to deliver the killing blow that night. She stood up slowly from her chair. Her face was impassive. She walked over to Travante, took the phone that was still connected to Calisso, and hung up the call calmly. Vianne looked her husband straight in the eyes and said with a soft but piercing voice, "Baby, it seems your friend has a lot of problems, doesn't she? Yelling about $1 million and all that. Who exactly is she, and why does she sound like she has so much claim over my daddy's money?" The question was simple, but deadly. Travante stammered, his tongue tied, unable to invent another lie. Cold sweat ran down his temples. Eudora faked a loud cough to divert attention. Vianne smiled sideways, a smile that froze Travante's blood. Without waiting for an answer, Vianne turned around and headed to her room. "Fix your business with that friend, baby. I don't like strangers making noise in my house. And you, Mother Eudora, should rest. High blood pressure isn't good for seniors afraid of ending up in a home." Vianne closed her bedroom door firmly. Behind the door, she let out a small laugh. She had done it. Travante was now trapped between Calisso's fury, Eudora's anger, and Vianne's suspicion. Tomorrow was execution day, the day Vianne had promised the fund transfer. Travante didn't know that what would clear tomorrow wouldn't be money, but the bloody tears of his regret. The morning sun rays were intense, as if the universe itself were heating up the atmosphere for what was going to happen that day. Travante got up earlier than usual. His eyes shone with expectation, although the dark circles from lack of sleep were still visible on his face. Today was the day he had been waiting for, the day he believed his destiny would change and he would become a millionaire. He put on his best suit, ironed impeccably by Vianne, combed his hair with care, and sprayed an excessive amount of expensive cologne. In front of the mirror, Travante practiced a victory smile, imagining himself signing a check for $1 million. Meanwhile, Eudora wasn't any less excited. The woman put on an elegant church suit she had bought specially for the occasion, complete with a silk shawl she paraded around as if she were a grand dame about to receive an award. Vianne watched all that activity from the dining table with an overwhelming calm, like the surface of a quiet lake hiding a deadly whirlpool inside. She had already prepared everything. The execution stage was ready at her father's office. The trip to Vianne's father's office was done in 2 separate cars. Travante insisted that Calisso accompany them. His excuse to Vianne was that Calisso, as a close friend, could act as a neutral and trusted notary witness. Vianne simply nodded without arguing, making Travante feel his plan was going smoothly. In reality, Vianne wanted Calisso to be there to see with her own eyes how the sandcastle they had built crumbled. Inside Travante's car, the atmosphere was tense but full of contained euphoria. Travante drove with sweaty hands while Eudora, seated next to him, wouldn't stop praying for the money to clear without hitches. Calisso, seated in the back to keep up appearances, wouldn't stop touching up her makeup, ensuring she looked perfect in the moment of victory. She imagined that after the signing, Travante would take her straight to a luxury car dealership. The skyscraper of Vianne's father's company rose imposingly in downtown Atlanta, clad in blue glass reflecting the clouds. Upon entering the majestic lobby with its polished marble floor, Travante's confidence wavered a bit. He always felt small in front of his father-in-law, who possessed a strong aura of leadership. But the image of the $1 million strengthened his resolve. They were greeted by Mr. Sterling's personal executive assistant, a kind but stern-faced woman. They were led to the main boardroom on the top floor, a VIP room normally only used for shareholder meetings or signing multi-million-dollar contracts. The room was huge, dominated by a long, gleaming mahogany table and comfortable leather chairs. The view of the city from the floor-to-ceiling windows was impressive, as if offering the world in the palm of one's hand. At the head of the table, Vianne's father was already waiting. His face was calm, imposing, and unreadable. He didn't smile when his son-in-law and his daughter's mother-in-law entered. He just nodded briefly, inviting them to sit. Travante, Eudora, and Calisso sat together on one side of the table, while Vianne sat on the other, right next to her father. This arrangement unconsciously created a clear division between us and them. Travante tried to break the ice asking about his father-in-law's health, but only received a brief grunt that intimidated him again. A notary and the company lawyer were also present, looking through thick files, adding an air of formality and seriousness to the meeting. Travante's heart was pounding. His eyes didn't leave the stack of documents he believed contained the asset transfer and the promised check. Eudora clutched her purse nervously, while Calisso tried to sit upright, despite the back pain from the pregnancy. Vianne's father opened the meeting with his deep, gravelly voice. He spoke of the importance of trust and integrity in managing family assets. The words trust and integrity were pronounced with special emphasis, making Travante feel a bit targeted, but he ignored it. Then the father explained the complicated procedure of the donation, taxes, management responsibility, and long-term commitment. Travante nodded enthusiastically, accepting all conditions without really listening. The only thing on his mind was where he had to sign for the money to be wired to his account. Eudora even interrupted with a naive question about whether she could withdraw a part in cash that same day, to which Vianne's father's lawyer responded with a withering look. After almost an hour of listening to a boring sermon on law and business, the awaited moment arrived. Vianne's father signaled the notary. The notary handed a dark blue folder to Travante. Travante's hands trembled as he received it. He opened it slowly, expecting to see a cashier's check or a bond. However, the folder was empty. There was only a blank sheet of paper inside. Travante frowned in confusion, looking at Vianne's father with a questioning expression. Vianne's father smiled slightly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He said calmly that before handing over the original documents, there was an indispensable condition the beneficiary had to meet. That condition was the verification of family harmony through family documentation. Travante and Eudora looked at each other confused. Family documentation? They had to take a picture together? Travante nodded quickly, saying he was willing to do anything. He even put his arm around his mother's shoulder, showing how harmonious they were. Calisso remained silent next to them, feeling a bit excluded from the happy family scene. Vianne's father picked up a small remote from the table, pressed a button, and the automatic blinds closed, darkening the room. A large projector screen descended slowly from the ceiling. Travante smiled broadly, thinking they were going to watch a wedding video or childhood photos of Vianne as a nostalgic gesture before the inheritance handover. He was already prepared to put on an emotional face. The projector screen lit up with a bright white, blinding for a moment. Then an audio visualization appeared, moving sound waves. There was no image, just sound. Silence took over the room, and then the voice was heard. A very familiar voice. Travante's voice, clear, loud, and without distortion. Just wait until that $1 million check from her daddy clears. I'm going to leave that simple-minded wife of mine with nothing, and we're going to get married and raise this baby together. Travante's face, previously radiant, turned as pale as the blank paper in the folder. His eyes went wide, staring at the screen as if he saw a ghost. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His heart seemed to stop. Before he could process what was happening, the next voice appeared. A woman's voice. "That wife of yours is completely clueless, right, baby?" It was Calisso's voice. Calisso, sitting in the room, jumped. Instinctively, she covered her mouth. Her eyes went wide, looking at Vianne with horror. Then the laughter of both was heard, a mocking, condescending laugh, a laugh that at the time seemed so pleasant to them, but now sounded like the death knell. The recording continued, playing the disgusting conversation about their plans to raise their illegitimate child with Vianne's father's money, about how sick Travante was of his wife, and how naive Vianne was in his eyes. With every second that passed, the air in the room seemed to run out for Travante, Calisso, and Eudora. Eudora, sitting in the middle, looked like she had suffered a mild stroke. Her face was frozen, her breathing shallow. She turned her head stiffly toward her son, then toward Calisso, and finally toward Vianne, who was sitting quietly with an impassive face. Vianne wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking directly at the three people in front of her, enjoying every grimace of terror that appeared on their faces. Vianne's gaze was cold, penetrating, and deadly. There was nothing left of the sweet and obedient Vianne. There stood a betrayed woman who now stood as the judge of her traitors. The recording ended with the dramatic click of the phone hanging up. The lights in the room came back on, exposing the faces of the sinners, now covered in cold sweat. The silence that followed was much more terrifying than the sound of the recording. No one dared to speak. Travante felt his knees go weak. He gripped the arms of the chair so as not to fall. He tried to search for words to defend himself, but his mind was blank. The truth was too evident, too naked. Vianne's father put the remote down on the table with a dry thud that made them jump. It was the judge's gavel, starting the real trial. The atmosphere in the VIP boardroom turned into a frozen hell. The air conditioning couldn't cool the thick drops of sweat running down Travante's temples. He swallowed saliva, which felt like prickly sand in his throat. His cunning mind desperately searched for an escape, an excuse, a scapegoat. With a trembling voice, Travante finally broke the silence. He stood up on shaky legs and pointed at the now blank screen. He shouted with a forced tone that it was all a lie. He accused the recording of being fake, a product of AI or deepfake technology. He swore to God and on his mother's life that he had never said something so vile. He acted as if he were the victim of a cruel slander, hoping to see a glimmer of doubt in his father-in-law's eyes. Eudora, hearing her son's defense, joined instantly with crocodile tears that sprang up suddenly. She wailed, saying her son was a good man, incapable of committing adultery or having bad intentions. She even dared to accuse Vianne of fabricating the recording out of jealousy, or to keep the whole inheritance. Calisso, for her part, opted to keep a deathly silence. Her face was pale as wax. She kept her head down, not daring to look at anyone. Her survival instinct told her the situation was unsalvageable. Vianne listened to all those denials with an ironic and contemptuous smile. She wasn't surprised. She had already foreseen that Travante would hide behind the technology excuse. Without saying a word, Vianne opened her briefcase, took out a thick brown envelope, and threw it into the center of the table, right in front of Travante. The envelope slid smoothly over the polished surface and stopped when it hit Travante's water glass. "You can't fake a sonogram or the chat history from your phone, baby," Vianne said with a flat tone that chilled the bones. Travante's hands shook violently as he opened the envelope. Its contents spilled out. Sonogram photos of a fetus with the patient's name, Calisso, clearly printed in the top corner, along with the exam date, which coincided with a business trip of Travante's. There was also a stack of screenshots of text conversations between Travante and Calisso, full of affectionate words, secret wedding plans, complaints about Vianne, and proof of the monthly Cash App transfers Travante sent to Calisso. And to make matters worse, there was the photo of the baby item receipt Vianne had found in Eudora's purse, with Travante's loyalty number included. All the evidence was real, physical, and irrefutable. Travante's denial about AI shattered before those papers. Travante collapsed in his chair, defeated. His shoulders slumped, his gaze lost in the sonogram he held in his hand. He was finished. He was completely finished. Eudora, seeing the proof of the shopping receipt, gasped, her face red with shame and fear. She realized her carelessness had been one of the nails in the coffin. Vianne's father, who had watched the drama of denials in silence, finally stood up. His figure, tall and bulky, seemed to radiate a contained anger. With a voice that wasn't loud but full of authority, he pronounced his verdict. He declared firmly that there was no $1 million. There never was and never would be for a traitor. The story of the fund transfer was just bait, suggested by Vianne to bring their greed to light. Then Vianne's father pointed at Travante. He fired him from his position at the company's subsidiary right then and there. All company perks, including the car, the laptop, and the corporate credit card, were revoked and blocked in the moment. Travante had not only lost the future inheritance, but also his job, his career, and his reputation in the business world, because Vianne's father would ensure his name was blacklisted in every circle in Atlanta. "And as for you," he said, addressing Calisso, "I'll make sure you never work at any reputable company in this city again. You betrayed the friend who considered you a sister for a little money. Enjoy your life with this unemployed man." Calisso began to sob quietly, a cry of late regret. But Travante's nightmare wasn't over. Hearing there was no money, his mind flew immediately to the massive debt he had incurred a few days prior. He had borrowed money from a loan shark using a fake deed as collateral, assuming he could pay it today with Vianne's father's money. Now that source of income had vanished. That meant he had a gigantic debt about to come due, with interest that wouldn't stop growing and invalid collateral. His life was in danger. Travante's face went from pale to ashen. He realized he wasn't just poor, but in grave danger. Suddenly, Travante dropped to his knees on the floor and crawled toward Vianne's feet. He cried out loud, stripping himself of all dignity. He begged for forgiveness, saying it had been a slip, that he was bewitched, that the devil had tempted him. He swore he would leave Calisso right then and there and go back to being a good husband. He clung to the hem of Vianne's dress, kissing it hysterically. Eudora also joined the crying, begging her son's father-in-law not to be so cruel, reminding him of the sin of breaking family ties. The scene was pathetic and disgusting at the same time. Vianne looked at the man prostrate at her feet. The man she once loved, the man she trusted to lead her home, was now nothing but trash begging for mercy. With a slow but firm movement, Vianne pulled her dress away from Travante's grip, as if he had just touched something dirty. She took a step back, keeping her distance. Then, Vianne took off her wedding ring from her ring finger. The white gold ring with diamonds Travante had put on her with promises of faithfulness. She looked at the ring for a moment and with a slight gesture dropped it to the floor, right in front of Travante's tear-stained face. The ring clinking against the marble echoed in the silent room. "Pick it up, baby. It's the only thing left of our marriage. Pawn it to buy milk for your son and for Calisso. Or maybe it's enough to pay for your bus ticket back because the car downstairs has already been confiscated by my daddy's driver." Vianne pronounced those words with a final tone. There was no tremble of sadness, just immense relief. She felt a great weight had just been lifted off her shoulders. Travante looked at the ring with desperation and then at Vianne, who stood tall like an unbreakable tower. The building's security guards entered then, called by the assistant, and dragged out a Travante, who was still crying hysterically, a Eudora pretending to faint, and a Calisso walking with her head down in shame. Travante's screams still echoed in the hallway until the elevator doors closed, taking the trash of Vianne's life with them. In the room, Vianne exhaled a long sigh, turned around and hugged her father. Her armor cracked a little, her tears fell, but this time they weren't tears of sadness, but of liberation. She had won, she was safe, and she was ready to watch karma work in its own way, much crueler out there. The midday sun shone brightly, burning mercilessly the skin of anyone exposed. On the sidewalk, in front of the imposing office building of Vianne's father, 3 human figures stood with empty faces and an appearance that contrasted with their surroundings. Travante, Eudora, and Calisso had just been forcibly ejected by security. They stood there, stunned, on the edge of a busy avenue. The street dust flew up, hitting their faces still wet with cold sweat and the remnants of tears. The luxury company car they had arrived in with pride that morning had already been returned to the company garage. Travante's wallet was empty, his credit cards blocked, and the wedding ring Vianne had thrown had stayed on the boardroom floor because Travante was too panicked when they dragged him out. They truly had nothing but the clothes on their backs and unbearable shame. People passing by looked at them strangely, and rightly so. Eudora, dressed in a flashy church suit, was sitting on the dirty curb. Calisso was crying openly while holding her belly, and Travante, in his impeccable suit, looked like a madman who had lost his mind. The silence between them broke when Eudora started blaming the situation. With a hoarse voice, she hit Travante's arm, screaming and asking what was going to become of her now. She demanded Travante take responsibility for bringing her from the country, only to be humiliated like that. Eudora also blamed Calisso. She pointed at Calisso with her trembling finger, accusing her of bringing bad luck. According to Eudora, if Calisso hadn't seduced Travante, Vianne wouldn't be so furious, and she could still enjoy the comforts of her daughter-in-law's house. Calisso, pregnant and with emotions running high, didn't accept the blame. She responded to Eudora's screams with a shrill voice, shouting that she was the victim of Travante's sweet promises. She said she became his mistress because Travante had promised her luxury, not poverty and humiliation on the street. A heated argument broke out right on the sidewalk, becoming a free show for delivery drivers waiting nearby. Travante ignored the fight between his mother and his mistress. His mind was occupied with a terror much more real than his mother's reproaches. He remembered the loan shark. Today was the deadline for the first interest payment, and the return of the principal if he wanted to get the house deed back. The problem was the deed he had given as collateral was fake, and he didn't have a dime. Travante reached into his pants pocket and took out his phone with trembling hands. He had dozens of missed calls from an unknown number. He felt his heart jumping out of his chest. He knew who was calling. The debt collectors must have smelled something was wrong. Travante tried to turn off the phone and run, but before he could press the button, he received a text message. It was short, but terrifying. "We know where you are. Don't run, or your mama becomes the collateral." Travante froze. His eyes scanned the surroundings frantically, looking for signs of danger. And sure enough, from a corner, 3 black sports bikes advanced slowly against traffic and stopped right in front of them. The riders were burly men in black leather jackets and menacing faces. They got off the bikes calmly but intimidatingly. An aura of violence filled the air. Travante recognized one of them, the right-hand man of the loan shark boss, the one who had handled his loan. The man took off his helmet, looking at Travante with a crooked smile revealing gold teeth. He walked up to Travante and tapped his cheek, soft but painful. He asked with fake kindness where his money was. Travante backed away, scared, unable to speak. He tried to lie, saying there was a technical problem at the bank and the money would be available tomorrow. But the thug wasn't stupid. He laughed out loud, a laugh that made Caliso scream in fear and hide behind Eudora. The man grabbed Travante by the collar of his jacket and pulled him close until their faces were inches apart. He whispered roughly that his boss had already verified the authenticity of the deed at the records office that morning because he suspected his behavior. The result? The deed was fake. That meant Travante had committed fraud against the sharks of the underworld, and scamming a loan shark had a much more severe punishment than the law. The man signaled his partners. The other 2 thugs grabbed Travante and held his arms behind his back. Travante screamed in pain, begging for mercy, saying he didn't know the deed was fake, but his screams were ignored. They started dragging him toward a black van that had just pulled up. Eudora, hysterical seeing her only son treated like an animal, tried to grab one of the thugs' clothes, begging them to let him go, but an old woman's strength was no match. One of the thugs pushed her roughly, making her fall onto the hot asphalt. Her knees scraped, and her elegant suit got dirty with street dust. Eudora cried out loud, calling for Travante. Meanwhile, Caliso, scared to death, tried to escape. She saw an opportunity while the thugs were busy with Travante and his mother. She backed away slowly and then turned to run toward a taxi stand. She didn't care about Travante or Eudora anymore. The important thing was that she and her baby were safe. But karma wasn't done with her yet. She had barely run a few steps when a police car with sirens on cut her off. 2 female officers got out and stopped her. Caliso, confused and in panic, asked what was happening. She felt she hadn't committed any crime. The police showed her an arrest warrant. Vianne hadn't been joking. She had reported Caliso for embezzlement. Over the years, Vianne had entrusted Caliso with money for shopping or to pay for things in common, but it turned out Caliso often kept a part or used it for her own expenses. Vianne had proof of transfers and complete financial records. Caliso resisted, shouting it was a misunderstanding, that she was Vianne's best friend. But the police didn't care. Cold metal handcuffs closed on her wrists. The pregnant woman was led to the police car, crying over her fate, which had changed drastically in a matter of hours. Returning to Travante, the situation became even more chaotic. The thugs were about to put him in the van when another police siren was heard approaching. The commotion on a main avenue had attracted a patrol's attention, plus the call from the building security. Seeing the police, the thugs didn't want to risk getting caught. They let Travante go roughly, gave him a kick to the stomach as a goodbye, and fled at full speed on their bikes, weaving through traffic. Travante coughed, holding his painful stomach, and collapsed on the sidewalk. He thought he was safe, but it turned out the police hadn't come to help him, but to arrest him. Vianne's father had reported Travante for document forgery and attempted fraud using someone else's property. With the deed case, Travante had no escape. In front of his own mother, Travante was handcuffed. The scene that noon was tragic, and at the same time, a relief for anyone who knew the real story. Travante was led to the police car with a bruised face and wrinkled clothes. Caliso had already been detained in another car, leaving only Eudora alone on the sidewalk. The woman who that morning had arrived with her chin held high was now on her knees on the hot asphalt, lamenting her fate. Her favorite son, arrested for fraud. Her ideal future daughter-in-law, a criminal. And she herself, abandoned in the big city without a dime to return to the country. No one helped her. People just watched and recorded the scene with their phones, maybe to make it viral on social media with the caption, "Instant karma for a greedy family." In the distance, a luxury black sedan drove by slowly. The tinted window rolled down a bit, enough to reveal a pair of eyes watching the scene coldly. It was Vianne. She saw it all. She saw her ex-husband being dragged by the police. She saw her ex-best friend crying behind the bars of a patrol car, and she saw her evil ex-mother-in-law, now humiliated on the street. There was no mercy in Vianne's heart. She had given them many chances to rethink, but they chose greed. Vianne rolled up the window, ordered the driver to keep going. She wouldn't stop. She wouldn't look back. For her, the trash had already been thrown where it belonged, and now it was time to clean the dust remnants from her life to move toward a clean future. Vianne's car made its way through the city bustle, leaving behind the pathetic drama on the sidewalk as a dark chapter already closed. 6 months had passed since the shocking event in front of the office building. Time passed very differently for each person involved in this story. For Travante, time crawled slowly and painfully behind prison bars. He was found guilty of document forgery and fraud, plus the burden of the debt to the loan shark, who didn't leave him alone even in jail. In his narrow and damp cell, Travante lost all his arrogance. He was no longer the elegant and haughty man. Now his head was shaved. His body was gaunt from stress and prison food. He was often the target of harassment by other inmates who despised family fraud crimes. Every night, Travante slept curled up on the cold floor, accompanied by endless regret. He often dreamed of the comfortable life he had with Vianne, the hot coffee in the mornings, the ironed clothes, and his wife's sincere smile. Upon waking, he only found damp concrete walls and the smell of urine. He missed Vianne, not out of love, but because he realized how stupid he was to trade a diamond for a handful of sharp rocks. Calisso's fate was no less miserable. Due to her advanced pregnancy, her legal process was delayed a bit. However, she had to serve house arrest under strict surveillance and live in absolute poverty. She gave birth in a small community clinic with basic facilities without the company of a husband or her family. The child born was a boy, just as Eudora hoped, but his birth wasn't celebrated with lavish parties or a dream nursery. The baby was born amidst tears of lack. Calisso had to accept sporadic jobs as a cleaner by the hour, carrying her baby on her back because she couldn't afford daycare. Her face, previously always kept up, was now dull and looked much older. She lived in a small rental apartment in a rough neighborhood with a roof that leaked every time it rained. Every time she heard her son cry from hunger, Calisso cursed herself. She remembered how she mocked Vianne, and now she felt how hard life was without support, a life she herself had destroyed on a whim. Meanwhile, in a town far from the city bustle, Eudora spent the rest of her life in overwhelming loneliness. After the arrest, social services sent her back to her rural home, but the news of her son's crimes had spread everywhere. The neighbors, to whom she previously bragged about her son's success, now looked at her with disdain. No one wanted to be her friend. The stores wouldn't give her credit. Eudora suffered a mild stroke due to the prolonged shock, which left half her body paralyzed. She had to drag her leg just to get a glass of water. Her house, previously tidy, was now dirty and messy because she couldn't clean it. She often sat on the porch, looking at the empty dirt road, waiting for Travante's luxury car to come get her. But it was just a hallucination. She remembered how good Vianne had been, her daughter-in-law, who always sent her medicine, clothes, and money without complaining. Eudora cried in silence. Her tears fell on the dusty ground. Her arrogance had burned the bridge to happiness, and now she was trapped alone on the island of regret. In contrast to the suffering of the three, Vianne's life shone with its own light. Freed from the burden of the parasites that had been sucking her energy, Vianne focused on developing the business inherited from her father. She completely revamped the company management, introducing innovations that skyrocketed profits. Her appearance became even more elegant and distinguished. Her face, which before often looked sad from emotional pressure, was now always adorned with a sincere smile, radiating inner peace. Vianne also became actively involved in various social activities, helping women victims of domestic violence and betrayal to recover, just as she herself had done. She became an inspiration to many. Her broken marriage didn't traumatize her, but made her stronger and more selective. Her father was very proud of his daughter's transformation. They often spent time together, enjoying the fruits of their labor in peace, without the fear of being taken advantage of by cunning people. One sunny afternoon, Vianne was sitting at her favorite outdoor cafe, enjoying a cup of chamomile tea while reading a book. A gentle breeze played with the edge of her scarf. Her phone on the table vibrated. Vianne looked at the screen. An unknown number appeared, but the area code was from the area where Travante's prison was. Vianne knew it must be him. Maybe he had borrowed a phone from a guard or smuggled it in, trying to contact her to ask for help, money, or simply to apologize and relieve his guilt. In the past, Vianne might have answered, listening with a pounding heart, and maybe she would have softened. But the Vianne of now was a new woman. She looked at the screen without emotion. There was no explosive hate, just absolute indifference. To her, Travante was a closed past, a chapter of a book she had sealed and whose key she had thrown away. Vianne smiled slightly, very slightly. Her index finger moved slowly toward the phone screen. She didn't slide the green button to answer, but pressed the red button to reject the call and didn't stop there. She went into the call settings menu and selected the option to block the number. The phone screen went back to calm, showing a beautiful wallpaper of a natural landscape. Vianne went back to sipping her hot tea, feeling the warmth of the liquid run through her body, as warm as the sensation of freedom she now possessed completely. She looked up at the orange and gold sky of the sunset. Her life had just started anew, and this time she was the scriptwriter, with no antagonists who could ruin it. In the distance, birds flew freely back to their nests, just like Vianne's heart, which had finally come home to a place of peace and happiness. Did you like the story, and which city are you listening from? Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story, with love and respect.